A pattern of erased African-American cemeteries across the Tampa Bay area. Tonight, the story changes a little as a family calls on the local Catholic diocese for help finding their lost loved one. You're watching 10 Tampa Bay at 6 o'clock. I'm Carolina Lead. 10 Investigates Emerald Morrow takes you to the old St. Mary's Cemetery in Tampa. The diocese says all the graves were moved to Myrtle Hill, but Emerald, some are not convinced.
Not at all, Carolina. Now, when we first got a tip about this story last year, we began looking into what happened to this old Catholic cemetery. It used to be right here. That is now on old school property. Now, after seeing our initial report, a woman looking for her great-grandfather is convinced his grave is still there. Now, experts say she is most likely correct, and our investigation shows there could be hundreds more.
He came to Tampa to work in the cigar factories, and you know, it's America, and this is the land of opportunity.
At the time, Ybor City was the cigar capital of the world. To Bernardo Alvarez, it was home.
He came straight from Spain in the late 1800s.
Newspaper articles describe him as one of the best-known men in the city until tragedy struck.
Unfortunately, in 1907, he was murdered.
The circumstances around his death are not clear, but records show he was buried in the Catholic cemetery along North Florida Avenue in Tampa, also known as St. Mary's. The Diocese of St. Augustine owned it at the time. This deed shows leaders sold it to the Diocese of St. Petersburg in 1968. A spokesperson said they also turned over all records. This map from 1916 shows it was about twice the size as Zion Cemetery just down the road. There, archaeologists have already found about 300 graves under apartments and businesses and suspect there are several hundred more. We worked with local archaeologists who placed the old St. Mary's maps over today's landscape, showing where the cemetery would be today.
I started searching summer of 2014, and nobody knew about the cemetery.
And Alexia Saveda has been searching for her great-grandfather's remains ever since. Not just for her, but for her family.
And it's been frustrating. You know, I really hit a dead end 7 years ago.
Here's why. Newspaper records show in 1925, religious leaders voted to acquire part of Myrtle Hill Cemetery in Tampa. And in 1926, they started moving graves with plans to build Sacred Heart Academy. This article shows they relocated about 100 graves that year, but there are no available records showing they ever moved the rest, not even from Myrtle Hill.
And that's why you believe he may still be there.
Oh, I'm convinced, especially with what I'm hearing now coming out of Tampa. I was quite convinced then, and I'm even more convinced now that his remains were never moved.
I've reached out to you a number of times in hopes of getting an interview.
We called and emailed the Diocese of St. Petersburg over and over and over and over again, trying to get answers for Alexia. The best we got was this statement from the diocese saying no one would do an interview. A spokesperson also said the land that became Sacred Heart Academy was in part a graveyard, St. Mary's Cemetery, with 2 mausoleums. All the remains were moved from there to Myrtle Hill Cemetery in Tampa. The 2 mausoleums are still there. The Diocese of St. Petersburg acquired the land in 1968 after the remains had been removed. But archaeologists like Jeff Moats from Paleo West in St. Pete say most cemetery moves from that time were incomplete.
It's difficult to trust those statements. Relocating cemeteries, relocating burials is a difficult process. Today, it was difficult 100 years ago.
Moats played a key role in unearthing graves from Zion Cemetery and other erased cemeteries across our area, where people believed graves were moved. He also sat on the state's task force for abandoned African American cemeteries. He's an expert in using records, ground-penetrating radar, and archaeological digs to uncover buried remains.
The likelihood that there still are some remains there is high. And especially over the lessons that we've learned in the last couple of years. Relocating human burials is a difficult process, and it's not always the most thorough. And that understanding the law that human remains are protected whether they're on public or private property.
There are 2 mausoleums still there. Does that make this place still a cemetery?
I could say probably, yes.
And what would have to happen to get that place marked?
It's a simple process through the Division of Historical Resources. It's called a Florida Master Site File, and that can be filled out. And it's basically documentation that says there was a cemetery here, and there's information that may lead us to believe that there's still some remains located in this property.
After learning about our story, an archaeologist at the University of South Florida started this process, so it's officially on the record and has some protections in place.
It can be part of a review process, so if there was ever any sorts of construction or development planned for that particular parcel, the parcel would get flagged as potentially as a cemetery, and there would need to be some due diligence that occurs at that point before any of the ground disturbing activities occurred.
But those protections have limits. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the state and local level because there's nothing requiring local governments to review the Florida Master Site File. State Rep. Fentress Driscoll tried to address this with legislation creating an Office of Historic Cemeteries, but it never came to a full House vote.
We always thought, okay, well, this just means that this is another battle that we have to take up next legislative session.
Still, she calls on the Diocese of St. Petersburg to take action, even if it's not required.
Emerald, I think you really have to consider what is the right thing to do. And when you have this descendant community that's looking for their loved ones, the right thing to do would be to allow for something non-invasive like ground penetrating radar to try to find out if those graves are buried there.
The sooner the better, because I really would like to visit, with my dad and with my cousins. They're not getting younger. They want closure. They want to know, where are they? What happened? And especially with my great-grandfather, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to visit. There's nowhere to, connect those memories. And I want to give them that connection.
The Diocese of St. Petersburg refused our request for an in-person interview, and when we asked recently if leaders would consider testing the ground for graves, we didn't get a clear answer, although they did tell us last year they had no plans to do so.
Emerald has been following the discovery of hundreds of graves across our area for more than a year now. You can watch all of her reports right now on 10tampabay.com/erased.